Hello, I'm doing a book review, and as you can see, I'm not in my usual location. I'm actually in my car right now. That's because I'm currently cleaning my room, and let's just say that the area in my room where I normally do these videos is basically unoccupiable right now. And since I'm basically outside and I don't record these videos straight through, I record them in chunks and then edit them together, you might notice some dramatic changes in lighting. But the book I want to review is In the Flesh by Clive Barker. Now, this is actually volume 5 of Clive Barker's 6-volume anthology, The Books of Blood. It was published in the UK in 1985 as Books of Blood Volume 5, but it was published here in the States in 1986 as In the Flesh, which is actually the name of one of the stories in this collection. Now, I already reviewed the first 4 volumes of this series. Volume 4 of this series was published here in the States as The Inhuman Condition, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those reviews. Now, the first story in the collection is the title story, In the Flesh. Now, if you get the UK edition of this book, I believe this is actually the final story, but in the US edition, it's the first story. So, the plot of In the Flesh is it's set at this prison, and you follow this convict named Clive, who gets a new cellmate, a young man named Billy, and Billy is a young kid, like he's in his early 20s, but he honestly looks younger. And when Clive first sees Billy, he's like, oh yeah, this kid's dead meat, and in fact, some of the guards even tell him, hey, keep an eye on this kid and make sure nothing bad happens to him, okay? But as the story goes on, Clive and some of the other inmates start to notice that something is kind of off about Billy. Like, Billy starts asking questions about people who were hanged there, and you eventually find out that Billy is the grandson of a man who was hanged at this prison for murdering all his children, with the exception of Billy's mother. And it turns out that this man is actually buried on the prison grounds, and it turns out that Billy intentionally got himself locked up in this prison so he can see his grandfather. And as the story goes on, Clive, who at first was afraid for Billy, starts to become afraid of him. But this was a really interesting story. It is a ghost story, but it also has elements of body horror. But I highly recommend this story if you get this collection. Again, in this edition, it's the first story, but in the UK edition, it's the final story. The next story in here is The Forbidden, which is probably the most famous story in this collection, mainly because of the film adaptation and the franchise that the adaptation ended up spawning. Now, I'll talk about the movie and its subsequent sequels later on, but first I want to talk about the story itself. Now, The Forbidden is probably my second favorite story in this collection, and it's one of my favorite Clive Barker stories in general. Now, the plot of The Forbidden is it's set in Liverpool, England, and it follows this college student named Helen who is doing her thesis on graffiti, and she starts looking at and taking pictures of the graffiti at this ghetto in Liverpool, and she hears about this series of grisly murders and mutilations that have taken place there, and she becomes fascinated by these stories, but her fascination soon turns to obsession. But when she starts asking people about these murders, some of the residents there are almost too eager to talk to her, whereas others almost seem to be hiding something from her. And she eventually notices that this graffiti is making reference to some kind of a figure known as the Candyman. This is the story that introduces the character of Candyman, who, at least next to Pinhead from Hellraiser, is probably Clive Barker's most famous creation, although it might surprise people that the Candyman who shows up in the short story is actually quite different than his counterpart in the movies. Now, in the movies, they give Candyman a backstory, but in the short story, you never find out who or what Candyman is. You don't know if he's a demon or a ghost, or maybe even a reanimated corpse. I actually got the implication that he's actually some kind of a deity. But The Forbidden is an excellent story, and it's a story that definitely has a lot of social commentary on class and belief systems. Like, in the story, you follow the people of this impoverished community who have almost been outcast from society, and it's this whole idea that they need something to almost latch onto, like they need something to blame for the daily horrors of their lives. But I also got the implication in the story that Candyman is something ancient, like he's some kind of an ancient god that might have existed since the dawn of time, but the only reason it sort of takes on the form of this rotting corpse with a hook for a hand and bees in his chest is just because this being changes as society changes. And it's this whole idea that even in modern day society, there are still certain people who need to make sacrifice to ancient gods. But there's also sort of this implication that what if these people actually created Candyman? Like, what if it's an entity that was brought to life by their beliefs in him? And I sort of got the idea that what if these murders were not actually committed by Candyman, rather it was easier for the people of this community to blame the murders on a supernatural being, rather than admit that a human being could be capable of something like that. And what if the entity Candyman that we see at the end of the story was simply born out of society's need to find a scapegoat for the violence in our world? And Helen became so obsessed with this story that by the end, she became a part of the story. But yeah, The Forbidden is a great story. I highly recommend it. Now, it's worth noting that in the 70s, I think, so before this story, Clive Barker directed a short film called The Forbidden. Now, there's really no connection between the short story, The Forbidden, and the short film. If there is, it's something that you kind of have to dig a little bit deeper to understand. But the short film, The Forbidden, is very, very experimental and very surreal and dreamlike, but I do recommend it, especially if you like things like Eraserhead or Begotten. Now, The Forbidden was adapted into the 1992 horror film Candyman, which was directed by Bernard Rose. Now, I love the movie Candyman. It's one of my favorite horror films of all time. Now, the movie changes quite a bit from the original story. For example, the movie is actually set in America, specifically in Chicago's Cabrini Green. Now, while there was social commentary in the short story, Bernard Rose actually added social commentary by adding the element of race, because in the movie you find out that Candyman is actually the ghost of a black artist who was murdered in the 19th century, murdered simply for falling in love with a white woman. Now, in the film, Candyman was played beautifully by Tony Todd, who portrayed the character as being both creepy and sympathetic, because you do actually sympathize with him in the movie. Like, Bernard Rose really added a whole new element to that character with the film adaptation. And it's funny that Candyman has become Clive Barker's second most famous creation, yet the version of the character that pop culture remembers is specifically Bernard Rose's version of the character, which is radically different than the character who showed up in the short story. The movie also made Helen a far more interesting and sympathetic character. Now, in the film, Helen was played brilliantly by Virginia Madsen. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts on the movie Candyman, I recently did a review on the movie this past Halloween, which I highly recommend you check out. Like, I know this is a little egotistical and I might be biased, but I honestly think that's one of the best reviews I did recently. Now, Candyman spawned a sequel in 1995 called Candyman Farewell to the Flesh, which is an alright sequel. There are some things about that movie that I think are brilliant, and then there are some things about that movie that I thought were absolutely eye-rolling. The movie does expand upon Candyman's backstory. At the same time, it does kind of ruin the mystique of the character. The movie was also set in New Orleans, and it had a real opportunity to really explore that setting, and it really doesn't. There was also a straight-to-video sequel in 1999 called Candyman 3: Day of the Dead, and the less we know about that movie, the better. And then this year, 2021, you had Candyman, which was co-written and directed by Nia DaCosta and co-written and produced by Jordan Peele. And basically, 2021's Candyman acted as both a soft reboot of the franchise, as well as a direct sequel to the original Candyman, ignoring the continuity of the other two Candyman Candyman sequels, but I really liked 2021's Candyman. I thought it was easily the best of the Candyman sequels. It wasn't perfect, but it was a really good movie. I also recently reviewed the Candyman sequels. And what do you know, the lighting has changed. I'm recording this part of the video at a later time. Now, the third, and actually my favorite story in this collection, is the Madonna, which out of all the stories collected in here, I would say is probably the one that feels the most quintessential Barker. And what I mean by that is, when I think of Clive Barker's work, I think of things that are almost ferociously original, and I also think of stories that are very sexually transgressive, and I think that's one of the things that really stood out to people when Clive Barker first broke through into the literary world, is how sexually transgressive his stories were. And this story definitely fits into that category, and it reminds me a little bit of a story from Books of Blood, Volume 2, called Jacqueline S. Her Will and Testament. Like, both stories had very similar themes. Now, what the plot of the Madonna is, it's about this man named Jerry who recently purchased this abandoned bathhouse or pool house, and he's trying to convince this shady businessman named Garvey to fund the reconstruction of this place. So, while they're looking this building over, Garvey ends up seeing a naked woman, and he pursues her into the bathhouse and ends up seeing other women like her, but he also sees something swimming around in the pool, something not human, and eventually Jerry starts seeing these women and these creatures as well. And eventually in the story, both men end up going through a physical change, but both men also react very differently to this change. And this is definitely a body horror story, but it's a body horror story as only Clive Barker could have done, I think. But it's also body horror depending on how you want to look at it, because again, both men react to their punishment very differently. And gender is a major theme in this story, because both men don't really treat the women in their lives very well. Like, Garvey kind of views women as being nothing more than sexual objects, whereas Jerry is openly a lot nicer than Garvey. However, you find out that he doesn't really treat his girlfriend very well, and there is a scene in this story where he ends up raping his girlfriend. Well, he's having sex with her, and then she tells him to stop, but he keeps going, so yeah, he rapes her. So the two main characters of this story are basically misogynistic douchebags who do end up getting a comeuppance in the story, but again, one of them ends up kind of accepting his punishment, whereas the other can't handle it. But yeah, this was an absolutely brilliant story, and it's definitely the best in this particular collection, I think. Now, in the late 80s, there was an anthology comic book series called Tap in the Vein, which adapted several of the stories from Books of Blood, and this was actually one of the stories adapted for that comic book series. And the fourth and final story in this collection is Babel's Children, which stands apart from the other stories because it's not really a horror story. I mean, it is in a way. Like, you could make a case for this being a horror story, but it's really more of a straight political satire. Basically, the story is about this woman whose car breaks down, and she ends up at what appears to be like a monastery, and then she's approached by these nuns, but eventually she realizes that these are not nuns, but are actually men with guns, dressed as nuns, and they end up holding her hostage at what appears to be a psychiatric hospital, and she sees a lot of these elderly people there, and eventually one of them claims that they actually rule the world. It turns out that they decide all global politics at this place, but the thing is they can't leave, because if they leave, then things will fall apart. But this was a really good story. Again, it's more of a political satire than a straight horror story. And it's also very Twilight Zone-esque. Like, there's almost this Rod Serling sense of irony where the people who apparently rule the world live these horrible, miserable existences, and all they want to do is escape from this place. But this story was also really good. But yeah, I recommend all the stories in Books of Blood Volume 5 or In the Flesh. I thought all 4 of them were very top-notch. And not just the stories in here, but with the entirety of the Books of Blood, you could really see why people like Stephen King and Ramsey Campbell and Alan Moore really took an interest in Clive Barker when he first showed up on the scene. But yeah, that was my review on In the Flesh by Clive Barker, and bye.